Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Shoaib. Thank you very much for the introduction. So, first and foremost, I didn't have any protein. I'm just taller because I'm standing on a podium, so I'm too short for the actual platform. So please don't mind the extravagance if I look too tall. I'm not. I'm very short and proud of it. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to Fika for organizing this event. I personally didn't expect it to turn out. Alhamdulillah, we got a lot of positive reception. So I'm very glad that we've got a lot of different age groups coming in from different backgrounds. It's really great to see us. So thank you very much for inviting me. My topic today will be on atheism and Islam. And this is something that I've been researching on for the past 1 or 2 years. It's a great interest of mine. Atheism, Islam, science, and religion, those are the two main territories that I look into. Even though I teach the natural sciences, my research is entirely on these two domains. So I'm going to take some of the points that Shaykh Usman brilliantly discussed in his presentation, and hopefully I'll try and utilize them in the points that I'm going to be making today. So the overview of my presentation, did it change? Yeah. So the overview of my presentation is as follows. I'm just going to provide a quick overview of who new atheists are, some of their background information, and the books that they published. Following on from that, I'm going to try and sort of focus on what is exactly new about new atheism. And I'm going to make an argument, or at least a partial argument, what makes them distinctive from other variations of atheism is that they are especially focusing on Islam, which previous or other atheists haven't necessarily done. Then I'm going to move on and try and expose or discuss what are the contentions that new atheists bring forward. So this is a non-critical review. It's just literally giving them a charitable reading. Then I'm going to provide my own slight critique about where atheists go wrong, at least when they're either criticizing or characterizing Islam and religion. The second last topic will be about Muslims leaving Islam, so the ex-Muslim movement that's just kicking up. And finally, discussing the goal of new atheism and what sort of challenges that is posed for this world. So there's a lag here. Has it changed? Yeah, okay. So the new atheists, or the new atheism movement, started off with these 4 people. Now, when we think of new atheism, the first person that comes to mind is Richard Dawkins. But when you look at the chronology of the books that have been published, the first author to actually really make a dent in this was none other than Sam Harris. So this is the guy right here on your top left corner. He wrote a book called The End of Faith. And in this book, he provides sort of a us versus them mentality, a West versus Islam mentality. And he discusses how these are two different ideologies that are in conflict with one another. In other words, he takes Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations narrative and tries to refute Islam through that sort of ideology. He himself is a neuroscientist, and I think he's currently he works at Stanford University. Following Sam Harris in 2006, Daniel Dennett, who is the guy on the top right corner, he's a philosopher of mind, and he published several books, so this is not his first book, Breaking the Spell. But in this specific book, what he tries to do is provide an evolutionary account of the origins of religion. So for him, evolution is the defining worldview. Everything has to be explained from the evolutionary framework. And in this particular book, what he tries to do is, 1, explain how religions evolved from an evolutionary point of view, and 2, explain how religious ideas persist from an evolutionary point of view. Following this is the infamous Richard Dawkins, who was a biologist, and now he's retired and he's still giving speeches around the world, Oxford academic, and he wrote The God Delusion. I'm sure many of you know this book. So it's an interesting read. I mean, the book is very easy to follow through, which is why probably adds towards his contribution and success. And he tries to provide sweeping arguments against religion, Islam being one of them, Christianity, and Judaism as well. Following that is the last member, Christopher Hitchens, and unfortunately he passed away in 2011. In his book, God is Not Great, which is a wordplay on Allah Akbar. He's just trying to say that God is not great, as a negation of the Adhan. And in that book, he follows a very similar narrative as Sam Harris. What demarcates Hitchens from the other 3 is that the first 3 come from a scientific background, whereas Hitchens was a social political commentator. So he focuses more on that when criticizing Islam in one of the chapters. So that's an overview. Now, New Atheism starts off with these people, but doesn't necessarily end with them. Collectively, they're known as the Four Horsemen, and this is a title that was given to them based on media outlets. But there is an extension to New Atheism of people you may not have heard of. These include people like Professor Lawrence Krauss. Lawrence Krauss is a theoretical physicist, and he wrote a book, a very interesting book called A Universe from Nothing, where he argues that the universe literally came from nothing, which has been criticized, but we can get into that later. Michael Shermer, who is an editor of something called The Skeptic Magazine, where he discusses about his atheistic views. He's an expert on mind, consciousness, those sort of cognitive studies. The next on the list is Victor Stenger, and he passed away recently as well. He's a theoretical physicist, and he has written several books on science, religion, and atheism. And finally, A.C. Grilling, who I think is British, and he's a philosopher, a professional philosopher. And he's also written a few books on God and humanism and atheism. So the New Atheism isn't just restricted to the first part that I've mentioned. It's still a growing movement, and you have many new faces coming up. Now, keeping that in mind, what I wanted to do was, at least initially when I was looking at this topic, why are they called New Atheism? What is exactly the thing about them? And some people argue that the newness about them is their books, their extravagant rhetoric, it's their TV appearances, or the millions of copies of books that they've sold. But I think that when I was drilling down further into this, I realized that some authors reached a startling observation. And they came to the conclusion that what seems to be new about New Atheism is that they haven't spared Islam from their criticism. So I'm going to share 4 quotations by 4 different scholars to sort of make this point. The first on this list is somebody called Ian Markham. He's a priest, a Christian thinker. This is what he has to say. Harris is the worst. He makes Islamophobia a central part of his message. Hitchens comes second. To his credit, he recognizes that the bad aspects of Islam are also found in Christianity and Judaism. In fact, for Hitchens, there are no good religious traditions. And the Dawkins, Islam is an illustration of the strange and bizarre behavior of religious people. And this is an interesting quotation. It is interesting to note how both Harris and Hitchens support the American war to Iraq primarily as a result of their deep prejudice against Islam. I'm going to go on to the next thinker. So Tina Beatty, she's written a lot on Christian ethics, Christianity, and feminism. And this is what she has to say. She writes, today, New Atheists are as hostile towards theologians as the most militant Victorian scientists were, but the battle lines are still drawn between 2 protagonists. So she's talking about the Victorian times. Christian men of God and Western men of science, in a way which reflects little of the plurality and diversity of other worldviews. In the 19th century, the religious other was made of all those barbarians and savages who littered the imperial globe with their presence. Today, it is Islam which constitutes the religious other, and it is still represented as a barbaric force to be conquered and civilized by the imperial powers of reason and progress, hinting that Islam needs a revolution or an enlightenment of itself. Now these are some broad conclusions that they have drawn from the works of atheism. The next 2 that I'm going to show you, they are a bit more specific in their observations. This is Professor William Emerson, and he's a Christian thinker. And this is what he writes. In my view, the newness of New Atheism has very little to do with its in-your-face, aggressive nature, or its popularity, or even its scientific approach to religion. What seems to distinguish it from earlier forms of atheism is the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle ways, it critiques and attacks Islam through its scattergun approach, a critique of religion in general. For the New Atheists, their general condemnation of religious targets not only Islamic extremism, but also Islam because, in the main, they admit to no meaningful distinction between moderate and extremist Islam. More than anything else, in my view, their attack on Islam is what puts the new in New Atheism. Islam in the New Atheist writings is consistently depicted as irrational, immoral, and its purest form, violent. The final author that I'd like to point out to is somebody called Stephen LeDroux. He's a sociologist, so he studies the behavior of people, and he recently published a book called The Politics of Atheism, and it's published by Oxford University Press. So by far one of the most amazing studies done on the configurations, at least on the social political level, of New Atheism. And here's what he has to say. For New Atheism, Islam represents both pre-modern and postmodern types of threats. As a religion founded on faith, it is a pre-modern threat to scientific modernity, and it illustrates the progressive evolution of human societies, with Islamic society representing barbarism and the West representing civilization. So the same, the West versus Islam narrative. But also it represents the postmodern threat, in that New Atheists believe that epistemic relativism and cultural pluralism have paradoxically rendered the West incapable of effectively dealing with the threat posed by radical Islam. And it concludes, Islam indeed is the most important element in New Atheist construction of an ideal of Western civilization. So I'd like to at least draw as a minimal conclusion from these quotations that New Atheism, at least what they thrive on in their narrative, whether it's intentional or not, is that Islam is a primary focus of their concern. This seems to be very, very clear from what I've gathered. And the other observation that I wanted to point out is that none of these scholars are Muslims. And I think that's a very important point to make in case anybody says that this is a victimizing narrative that I'm trying to portray. So let's move on. So what sort of contentions do New Atheists bring forward? I'm going to highlight three different points. One, that only science can do everything, so they adopt science as pretty much their religion. Two, they provide a narrative that Islam is a barbaric religion. And three, Islam is a stupid religion. So I'm just going to provide some quotations. Again, this is not a critical review. The critical aspect is going to come in a while. So now the idea that science can answer everything, it comes up and manifests itself in various different forms in their works. One strategy is to pit science against religion, and this is something that you can find particularly in the works of Hitchens. He writes in his book, "Religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. Where once it used to be able, by its total command of a worldview, to prevent the emergence of rivals, it can now only impede and retard, or to try to turn back the measurable advances we have made. Above all, we are in need of a renewed enlightenment, which will base itself on the proposition that the proper study of mankind is man and woman. We have to first transcend our prehistory, i.e. our religious history, and escape the gnarled hands which reach out to drag us back to the catacombs and reeking altars and the guilty pleasures of subjection and abjection. To clear the mind for this project, it has become necessary to know the enemy and to prepare the fight." So you can see there's a very heavy, what's it called, pitting of science against religion. Another example where this idea of science being able to answer everything comes in the form of when they try to neutralize God as a metaphysical being and try to reduce him into a physical explanation. So Dawkins, for example, since he only thinks with a scientific worldview, he thinks that God is a scientific question. He writes, either he exists or not, it is a scientific question. One day we may know the answer, and meanwhile we can say something pretty strong about the probability. So you can see that this is one way of trying to conform religion into a scientific narrative, creating problematic notions. Finally, another way of trying to prove that science can explain everything is when they use science to undermine religion. Now, to explain the quote that I put up there by Dennett, I want to first just provide an overview of what he says in the book. In his book, which I showed earlier, Breaking the Spell, as I mentioned, he tries to provide an evolutionary account of one, how religions were born, two, how religions persist from an evolutionary framework. So in a nutshell, I mean, there's more detail that I've mentioned in my monograph, is that he thinks that there was a group-like community that came into the picture because it provided a higher survival chance. In order to sustain the survival of the group, they had to conform to some sort of central ideology. And that is how religions came to be born. So in this context, he mentioned this particularly about Islam. He says, it is worth recalling that the Arabic word Islam means submission. The idea that Muslims should put proliferation of Islam ahead of their own interests is built right into the etymology of its name, showcasing the idea that Islam is nothing but an evolutionary product which tries to keep on surviving its mimetic and genetic idea through its participants, and that's how religions persist. So that's one of the ways in which they say that science can prove everything. The second contention is Islam is a barbaric religion, and you can see all sorts of quotations. I'm not going to bore you because this is a very standard thing that you can see, particularly in the media narrative. The yellow quote says, "We are at war with precisely the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran, and further elaborate in the literature of Hadith." So Harris is particularly very vehement that Islam is very, very violent. It is not an extremist religion that's the problem. Islam intrinsically, inherently is problematic. Hitchens, who is very similar to Harris, he provides a sort of Islam as an anti-Semitic religion. So here writes, Islam has never forgiven the Jews for encountering Muhammad and deciding that he was not the authentic messenger. And he goes on to say that religion is responsible for transmitting from one of mankind's most primitive illusions down through the generations. So from these quotations and ideologies, they are trying to say that Islam is intrinsically a violent, barbaric, and all this creates an us-them versus mentality. Finally, now this is a very interesting one. So they try to irrationalize Islam as a whole, as a religion. And they point to various instances where Muslims are quite central to an episode. So for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to provide some context. There was an episode in Nigeria back in 2009 where Nigeria decided to stop, or they have problems with accepting intervention from USA to provide some polio vaccinations. And because Muslims were a central part of this narrative, here's what Hitchens concludes from that. I'm going to provide more detail later on, but I'm just going to point this out. In northern Nigeria, a country that had previously checked in as a provisional polio-free, a group of Islamic religious figures issued a ruling or fatwa that declared polio vaccine to be a conspiracy by the United States and, amazingly, the United Nations against the Muslim faith. The drops were designed, said the mullahs, to sterilize the true believers. Their intention, in fact, was genocidal. Nobody was to swallow them or administer them to infants. Within months, polio was back, and not just in northern Nigeria. Nigerian travelers and pilgrims had taken it as far as Mecca and spread it back to several other polio-free countries, including 3 African ones, and also faraway Yemen. So, using such episodes, what he's trying to show is that Islam is stupid. It's a stupid religion, stupid followers, they're not clearly blind. So these are the broad, I say, observations that I at least got from their works. Now it's time to critically assess where they're going wrong. So I'm going to look at 3 key points I think are gravely problematic in their narrative. One is the distinction between science and scientism, and I think this is a distinction that's very important, particularly when you look at science and religion. Second is this idea of scriptural reductionism, and finally, scriptural selectivism. I'm going to start off with the first one. So there is a categorical mistake in confusing science with scientism. Now, as the Shaykh pointed out, science is a method. It is a method of inquiring about the natural world. It is built on a few certain presumptions. You apply those presumptions, you get some data from the observable world, and you try and draw a narrative out of it. It is a method. Scientism, on the other hand, is an ideology. It is when you believe that science can answer absolutely everything, every sort of question that can be asked can be answered one day by science. This is pretty much a grandiose version of science and taking it beyond its epistemic limits. Now, there's a whole course that we can do on the nature and the limits of science, and it has been pointed out by Shaykh Usman in his talk earlier. But I'm just going to provide a few examples of how science is a limited method in of itself. So science, first of all, is based on a few presumptions. Presumptions are pretty much these principles, working principles that science relies on for it to be able to get off the ground in the first place. Now, scientists may not admit them, they may not acknowledge them, or they may be unaware of them. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. Some of the presuppositions include temporal uniformity. By this I mean that if we have past observations, for example, if I drop this water bottle, I know according to the law of gravity it's going to fall. And I expect it to fall even tomorrow or after tomorrow, again and again and again. This is uniformity in time. We have this presupposition in order for us to do science. If, for example, the Newtonian laws stop working tomorrow, we're not going to be able to apply those laws anymore. The other is spatial uniformity. That if we do an experiment here, let's say, what's the name of this place? I forgot. What's the name of the city?
Walthamstow.
Walthamstow, yes. So if you're in Walthamstow and we do scientific laws, sorry, my memory is really bad and I'm falling by the time it's 1 a.m. there. So,
Say London.
so if this water bottle falls here, and if I do the same experiment in, I don't know, Dubai, and I expect the same results to occur, this is a presupposition of science, that uniform laws are extendable across all spatial territories. This is a presumption that is made. Fundamentally, we believe that there's order in the fabric of the universe, right? If we do not assume that there's order, science can never get off the ground. So these are presuppositions of science. The limits of science are, and there's tons and tons of books and literature that explain this, but science cannot answer some very fundamental questions. For example, ethics. Science cannot tell you what is right or wrong. Even though some atheists, for example, Sam Harris, he recently wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, where he tries to justify that science can be used to explain what right and wrong is. But that has been heavily criticized. As an example, consider a scientist. He makes a pill, right? And this pill can lethally kill you and doesn't leave a single biological trace in your body. Let's just say he developed that, yeah? Now, that is a scientific experiment telling you what the pill is capable of. But the moral question of whether that is good or bad does not come from the experiment itself. That comes from the moral agent who imposes that narrative. And that is something that science can never ever do. David Hume famously talked about this in the is-out distinction. Science only tells you what is. It can never tell you what is out to be. It can never tell you a normative command. And even, more simply put, the very claim that science can answer everything is not a scientific claim. It is a philosophical position, and therefore it is a self-refuting idea that science can claim everything. So this is just a brief, I think, point to be made, but I think it's very important to realize that there is science and scientism. And I think as Muslims particularly, we need to be very careful with this distinction, because I think we can fall into either extreme. On the one hand, we can fall into an anti-science narrative, where we believe that science has nothing to do with our world whatsoever. And on the other hand, we adopt the scientism worldview, and then we try to conform our entire theology according to science. And that can end up in a lot of problematic notions. For example, scientific miracles in the Quran, where we try to use science, we say, wow, there's so many scientific miracles in the Quran, but there are in fact none. So the balance, I think, is in between. The balance has to be in between. And there's a hadith which I put up here to sort of show the balance that we need to always adopt. In the hadith it says, reflect deeply upon the creation, but do not reflect upon the essence of the Creator. For verily, His essence cannot be known other than to believe in it. So what the hadith is just trying to say is that Allah is, remember, an infinite being. He's beyond any finite capacities. Human beings, on the other hand, we think in a finite manner, we speak in a finite manner, our conceptions are in a finite manner. We're pretty much bound by infinity. And you can never actually contain infinity in a finite medium, ever. So because of that, if you try to do that, you're going to end up with a lot of paradoxes when you start thinking about God a little bit too deeply. I mean, infinity as a mathematical concept has driven a lot of mathematicians insane. Imagine thinking about God, right? So that's why they always said to understand God or to get closer to God, look at how God has ordered and structured the world around you. That is why if you look at the golden age or the golden days of Islam, the reason why people were so enthusiastic about the world was it allowed them to understand how God infused the world with order, to understand sunnatullah, as the Shaykh mentioned, the idea of how God orders and habituates regularity into the universe. So this is, I think, the correct balance, where we take what science has to say, but also understand its limits. The second critique that I would like to mention is this idea of scriptural reductionism. Now, let me first go back to the Nigerian incident before I explain this. Hitchens was just trying to prove from this Nigerian instance that you have a Muslim event, and this is obviously a very bad thing that these Muslims have done, and it's bad because it's done by Muslims, and Muslims are bad because they follow Islam, and Islam is bad because it's in the Quran and Hadith. This is the narrative that they follow. Okay, this is scriptural reductionism. Now, of course, at any given event, of course, there's an Islamic element to it, in that there may be some Muslim involved in the picture, there may be some Islamic narratives in the picture, but there are many other factors which atheists very conveniently like to remove from their narrative. An event has cultural factors involved, it has social factors involved, psychological, political, economics. What they want to do is just ignore all of that, focus on the Islam part, and then trace it back to Scripture. Right? Now, the Nigerian instance that Hitchens was talking about earlier, I actually did some research on this, and it turns out that Hitchens, as expected, simplified a lot of the event's details. First of all, of course, there was a problem with Nigeria. The members of the Nigerian community did have an issue with the foreign aid, but largely because, first of all, there were two wars that just occurred in the Muslim world, one against Afghanistan, one against Iraq. So the people of Nigeria at the time were already quite anti-American in the attitude of their psychology, right? That's the first thing. Number two, the sparks of it being problematic was not because of a religious assimilation, it was because of a scientific one. Some local scientists in Nigeria, who were quite popular in Nigeria, they believed, I don't know what the evidence was, but they believed that these polio vaccinations had certain compounds that would lead to infertility. So it was actually a scientific reason why they were a bit skeptical about this vaccination aid. And contrary to what Hitchens said, that the mullahs were responsible for this, you can find many fatwas online by various bodies, including from Mecca and from local organizations within Africa, where they said that vaccinations must be done. It must be the case. So this is obviously conveniently removed off from Hitchens' narrative. And that's why I think it's very important to realize that whenever they criticize an event, what exactly is being missed out in the entirety of the picture. My final criticism is scriptural selectivism, which is they provide a minimal nuance or minimal attention to detail, surprisingly, given that they're academics. As an academic, you're supposed to look into the literature, charitably read what your opponent is saying, and then provide a critique. But look at these observations. Sam Harris spends 5 1/4 pages literally quoting verses one by one, stacking them up, one by one after another, to prove that Islam is a barbaric religion, without looking at the historical context or the surrounding thematic context of the verse, i.e. the verse before and after. Hitchens, who he became muhaddith in one day, so he looks at Bukhari's methodology in 6 sentences, like he was that much of an expert. So he looks at it in 6 sentences and simplifies, yep, this is pretty much trash, there's some problematic hadith, therefore we can dismiss the whole thing. Not realizing that we have 1,000 years of scholarship involved, where we look at the isnad, the matan, the usuls involved in trying to explain whether hadith is sahih, etc., etc. Then, even though he is the least provocative, I think he's by far one of the most sensitive when it comes to engaging with science, religion, atheism. He does casually state in one part of his book that the Quran undeniably declares that infidels and disbelievers deserve death, without going into providing a coherent explanation of the Arabic context or history. And finally, Dawkins, he taps into this idea of abrogation, nasakh mansukh, for those of you who are familiar with the Arabic, and he explains that how there's this concept in Islam where certain verses superseded previous verses that were previously revealed, and this is the source of why Muslims are so barbaric and violent, and that's the trace of this scriptural problem. Not realizing that when you actually check what's his reference, it's a book, it's pretty much one author, Patrick Sukadu, who is known to be an anti-Islam propagandist and has been criticized severely by other scholars. So you see it's a very selective reading list and a very selective way of looking at Islam, and I don't think it's a charitable reading whatsoever. Now, I want to move on to explaining why Muslims leave Islam. I think this is the most important slide for everyone here. There are 2 things that I want to look at. Number one, just explain the general factors, what are the factors that provide the stimulus for Muslims becoming atheists. And 2, who are the contemporary faces of new atheism, of ex-Muslim atheism. So from my review of the literature, there are 2 main books that look at how and why Muslims leave Islam. The book on your right-hand side is Arabs Without God. That looks at ex-Muslim atheists in the Middle East, so in an Eastern context. So for most of you, I don't think this is not applicable to you. The one on the right, Apostates, written by Simon Cotty, this is a review of Muslims leaving Islam in a Western context, UK, USA, Canada, right? Now, both of them generally agree on a large number of reasons why people leave Islam, but there are some socio-political differences regarding freedom of speech and etc., which we don't need to entertain here. But overall, they have some corroborative narratives. So there are 2 different, I divided these into cognitive elements and non-cognitive. By cognitive, I just mean anything to do with reason, pretty much, right? So some people left Islam, some Muslims leave Islam because they find proofs for the non-existence of God, be it from a philosophical angle or a scientific angle. Some people left Islam because they didn't want to listen to mullahs, they wanted to read the text themselves, so they read the Quran, they read the Hadiths, they found some problematic verses, so they decided to leave Islam, this is a bogus enterprise. So those were some of the reasons put there. And bear in mind, most of the interviewees are not theologians. They're just, they just try to approach the text themselves. The non-cognitive elements include stuff like social cultural elements, familial problems, trauma. So these may include like a parent who's very religious, but then obviously is hypocritical, so doesn't follow through with what he's saying. Abusive, you've got abusive families sometimes. Trauma in the sense that some people were so shocked by the 9/11 trauma, they bought into the Fox News narrative that this, of course, is because of Muslims and Islam, and etc., etc. So these are some of the various reasons. I mean, there's a lot of literature that you can get into, but I definitely recommend that you have a crack at that. There's a lot of good work coming out on this. Now, the most important part here is that the link between ex-Muslim atheism and new atheism is that the thing that affirmed, that validated their belief, was reading the works of new atheists, Dawkins, Hitchens, etc. And this is an observation made by Simon Cuddy in his book. Here he says, reading the work of atheists and agnostics was a fundamentally validating experience for respondents. Their own intuitions were correct, they were sound, their doubts had substance, and this recognition empowered them to move forward and to finally renounce Islam. It gave them the self-confidence to disavow. Because it legitimized their doubts, and with that legitimate and newly found self-confidence, their sense of guilt and anxiety began to fade. They were surely right in doubting Islam, so there was no reason to feel guilty or anxious anymore. That is why they thought, although their feelings were always tuned with this. So this is a clear evidence that if you want to engage with people who are having doubt and faith, begin to take their concerns quite seriously. Now, what's very interesting, just like you have representatives of new atheists on the front, we are now also gaining, and there is a growing movement of ex-Muslim atheists. I think in the UK you have the Council of Ex, was it the Council of Ex? Yeah, so that is, and then I think Namazi, she's behind them, right? So in the past few years, I've tried to see what sort of publications have come out by ex-Muslim atheists. These are some of the more recent ones. Atheism for Muslims, this came out last year. The year before that, Ali Rizvi, he's a Canadian Pakistani Muslim, or ex-Muslim. Then you have Hirsi Ali, I'm sure most of you have heard of her. She's a very famous ex-Muslim atheist. And 2014, Ahmed Navabi, he wrote the book, Why There Is No God. Now, I mean, the faces of ex-Muslim atheism are still growing. These are not, this is not an exhaustive list. But what I wanted to point out is that there's now growing literature of ex-Muslim atheism, which we need to worry about. And for me personally, as a Muslim, so I'm taking my academic hat off, I'm now putting my Muslim hat on, for me this is a bigger concern than new atheists. The reason why is because these guys are shown a lot of respect, particularly in Western context, because they made the bold decision to leave Islam. So they're the enlightened thinkers who left the religion, right? So they're treated as if they're the representative of Islam to the other, to non-Muslims. And I think this is a narrative that we need to be very careful of and pay a lot of attention to. For example, Hirsi Ali, she's written several books, and now she's a lecturer of Islamic studies at Harvard. So yeah, so this is something that you really need to take seriously. Ahmed Navabi, the book on your very right, the white book, Why There Is No God, 20 Reasons. Now that book is a very flimsy book. I found it to be very poor as a narrative. The reason why I point him out is because he has an organization called Atheist Alliance, if I'm not mistaken, and that has 2 million subscribers around the world. So they are definitely making a movement. They're definitely making an impact. These are not small people. These are people who have come out from the religious tradition, or the Islamic tradition, left Islam, are taken quite seriously by new atheists. I mean, nearly all of those people are very good friends with Dawkins, right? Nearly all those people on the list. And what's very interesting, now here's the point that I think we need to reflect on as a Muslim society. I read upon all of these texts, and here's what I found. Navabi, the guy whose book was on the very right-hand side, he mentions in his book that he nearly committed suicide when he was, I think, about 10 years old, because somebody told him that if you die before you are 14, you will die as a miskin, as an innocent. You will not have any sins upon you. So when you die, you're going to be a clean slate, and therefore God is going to accept you to heaven. Not realizing that somebody misinformed them, and somebody should have told them that it comes with a lot of extra qualification criteria. That's not the only thing, right? Or that's even a false narrative. Heresy, for example, she mentions in her book that she was stopped in asking too many questions, right? Because she was regarded as this might be feeble faith, very weak faith, by her parents. This was done by her parents. Heresy also went through FGM, female genital mutilation, right? So the reason why I'm pointing these out is because what it illustrates is that sometimes we are the problems ourselves. We create certain issues that lead people to leaving Islam, right? Another instance not mentioned on this list is some interviewees in those two books that I mentioned. They said that sometimes they found some opinions or fatwas that came up ridiculous, quite stupid to be frank. An instance is when a certain scholar from X place, right, he said that he came up with a fatwa that tomatoes and cucumbers need to be segregated in the grocery store. And the reason why he said that is because so in Arabic, in any language, right, you have male entities and you have female entities, right? So he said that I think the tomatoes are female and the cucumbers are male or something like that. And because they're opposite sex, you have to separate them. They cannot be mixed. So, and of course, I mean, when you have fatwas like that are beyond, reason and rationale, what do you think you're going to make Islam? A joke. It's going to become a mockery. Of course, this is what's going to happen. So we need to take some of these things seriously, and we need to reflect in our own communities whether the source is actually from our side rather than being an external thing. So that's a discussion that I think we need to really have open and try and really come to some definitive answer at some point in the future. And finally, I'm just going to conclude my session off. What is the eventual goal of New Atheism? Now, I'm going to refer back to Ledru, the sociologist that I mentioned earlier on. He has some very interesting conclusions which I seem to concur with. He writes, modernity for New Atheists is coterminous with secularization, which in their view is essentially the progressive universalization of scientism. Remember, scientism, not science. That is, the authority of science within political institutions, but more importantly, the adoption of a scientific worldview by individuals to such an extent that it becomes culturally dominant. And how do they intend to achieve this? The Drew also provides us with a response. He says, New Atheists adopt three central strategies. Number one, to discredit religious texts. And bear in mind, he said text in the beginning. Religious text as the very first thing. To discredit religious texts, institutions, and leaders. Two, to persuade others to adopt a worldview defined by scientism. And three, to build a sense of community and a positive collective identity for atheists in order to encourage them to come out. Right? So if you pay attention, so my whole narrative followed this template. That their strategy is that to promote science, and more importantly, scientism, and two, to discredit religious texts, institutions, and its corresponding leaders. It's a two-way strategy. And then allowing themselves to replicate amongst others, which is what we see in the manifestation of ex-Muslim atheists. So I'm just going to conclude there. That's a summary of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate it. I look forward to your questions. Bye. I'm going to step down because I feel awkward being on this.
Thank you, brother. Just a comment. Based on a personal experience, I've been engaged in heated discussions with young Muslim atheists or ex-Muslims for many years, different countries, and I can agree that 90% or more from the core cause of the atheism is not objective or cognitive reasons. Topics like evolution or Big Bang, it's a nice cover for a totally different context. When I dig inside, it's the problem of evil. They are not atheists, they are what we call in academia mesotheists. They are hating God, they're not disbelieving God. So I think we have to engage in this in many discussions that most young Muslims have issues with God, rather than not believing in God. They are hating God.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the thank you. So one of the respondents of the interviews.
Can you rephrase the question for people?
So was it a question or a comment?
Yeah, that's a comment. I mean,
Comment, but can you-
there's a nice book called Hating God, The Untold Story of Mesotheism, and another book by Paul Vietz, American psychologist, Faith of Fatherless, when he make a research on most famous atheists along history, and he found that most of them had issues with their father figure, whether his biological father or the priest of the church.
Yeah. So Dr. Ahmed, he mentioned pretty much this idea that most people, they don't leave Islam due to the cognitive reasons, which is what I concur with that. I think most of it's to do with the non-cognitive aspect, particularly their understanding of God. The idea that evil, suffering is a big problem, not just in the Muslim community, even in Christianity, it's a big issue. You have millions of people dying in starvation, horrendous horrors. Khashoggi is an example, the recent event, right? So when you have these, how do you explain God in light of these events? So this is a very, to one extent, there's an ideological problem here, but there's also a pastoral problem that needs to be faced. So yeah, I think it's a good point to mention.
Take a question from the tomato side.
We got anything over there for the tomatoes? Yeah? Oh, there we go.
I'm just going to repeat part of my earlier question because it wasn't really answered. Maybe it was not as relevant then. But I think that we're not accepting as a community this is quite a real danger. I have met youth who have had doubts, and I met somebody who suddenly, over the course of a few weeks of watching Lawrence Krauss videos, started to develop huge doubts, brought to the very brink. And she was in pieces, and she was at the despair. She didn't know how to deal with that. And that was very sad to watch when we sat and we discussed some of these arguments. But maybe, it's something for us to really think about. How are we addressing the intellectual doubts and questions? Because maybe some of the time we are brushing them under the carpet or not realizing that because we live in the age of social media, YouTube, all of this, that they have these at their fingertips, these arguments, these lectures. Anyone can Google it and watch it, and it's very easy for a young, vulnerable person to develop those doubts, and we have that duty, so maybe some advice on that.
Okay, so she's asked about, given that pretty much information is available at the click of a finger, and we can review a lot of different arguments against God and Islam, how are we supposed to sort of prepare for that as parents and as young people? So I would say, for me, the biggest issue is that historically, the way things used to work was that we had education leads, scholars, and they would deal with most of these issues by themselves. And then, of course, it would trickle down to the society, but this was largely an issue that was dealt by academics and scholars. We now live in an information-centric society, which is what you correctly pointed out. To the extent that nobody is now safe, pretty much nobody's insulated from the questions and doubts that are being forced upon young people. And I think in order to counter that narrative, this is why we now need to start having constructive programs on intersectional, interdisciplinary topics, science, religion, and philosophy. And that's one of the reasons why I created that course. We've done this before online. I did it before and created a huge interest. And I think this needs to be, it needs to be replicated around the world, where we now need to give our kids some theological training, even though they don't have any background, to create some platform where they have a good space, a safe space, where they can open up their concerns, and we can teach them in a very interdisciplinary fashion. Because the way these concerns are being brought up today is that they're going to be asked in a scientific context, or a philosophical context, or a theological. And as soon as you don't have background in either one or the other, they will get lost. So I think that is the key issue, education, proper education in modern contemporary issues.
Yeah.
Thank you, brother. I'm just following on from what you just said now. It just makes me realize how it's important for us to get together as a community and just have sessions like this, meetings like this, because we're in danger of becoming atomized just like everybody else. And then, because there is expertise among us, right? And if we just help each other, we can do so much. But when you mentioned about Ayan Hirsi Ali in Harvard and about these different and non-Muslim, post-Muslim, or whatever they call it, organizations, it made me think about funding and about institutions and about systems.
Yeah.
So is it not the case that part of this is part of something wider around the kind of war on so-called war on terror and countering violent extremism and these policies that are in the Muslim world and in this country as well, and it's part of something bigger, which is why it's being pushed so widely.
Okay, so to rephrase that, you're asking ex-Muslim atheists. They've been given a lot of infrastructural space, and whether there's something beyond just atheism that's sort of feeding that sort of system. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so. This is a sociological question. I'm not a sociologist, but I can guess that if there is a genuine push behind the scenes, if you have real puppeteers who are trying to force a certain narrative onto the world, then secularism is definitely a way to go forward. And how do you do that? You take representatives of that religion, find them, and then convert them, and then use them as edifications in that society. So yeah, I do agree that there may be something, but whether I'm the right person to ask, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so can we take a question in the back there and then we'll come to you?
So I got to
So,
Thank you very much for the presentation. Apologies I missed the first one, but if it was anything like yours, I'm sure it was excellent as well. Jazakallah khair.
thank you.
I think what's interesting and what's come out of your presentation is an issue of confidence when it comes to being able to deal with the likes of these new atheists or ex-Muslim characters. And I think I just wanted to kind of go through a short example actually, just to display how weak the premises upon which they built their entire institution are. And I think there isn't a more famous example of a scientist or somebody who represents these kind of people than Stephen Hawking. Obviously, he's now passed away. But obviously, in his recent kind of final book, obviously he's had a few books, Grand Design, etc. Then he had the brief answers to the big questions as a kind of recent one. He mentions the book is basically summarized into two claims that he makes. The first is that if there's any situation of the universe, when we look at the universe couldn't have been created because it's nothing. The universe adds up to nothing because it's made of positives and negative energy things, and positive and negatives cancel each other out.
Yeah.
That's his first claim.
Yeah.
And that's supposed to be a scientific claim. Now I say supposed to be because rationally that's completely ridiculous. And even everybody admits it. Now he's been wrong before on his information theory, on his Big Bang singularity theory, what have you. And frankly, he's already getting criticized for this, despite the fact that he's now dead. And the point here is that everybody knows that the fact that you have gravity, the fact that you have positive and negative energy, doesn't change the fact that decisions need to be made regarding things. Anything physical needs to have in Arabic a muqassis, a determining factor or a specifier for it to exist. Yeah.
Arguing from contingency. Yeah.
So a car moving forward, if I decide the car rolling backwards, that decision has to be made to stop the car for it to then roll backwards. His second claim is very simply not even a scientific one, which is hilarious really, because he basically says that there can't be God, obviously there's time, and at the beginning of the universe there was no time in which a God could have existed. In of itself, he's supposed to be a scientist, this guy, for goodness sake. This is just a philosophical, metaphysical claim. There's no testability, there's no experimentation linked to this, and what you see straight away is how this is their ultimate champion. Their ultimate fighting champion for these ideas are people like Stephen Hawking. And this is the strength of their ideas. They are fundamentally very, very weak. And they're not actually even scientific. Like you said, this scientism is upon which they basically frame them. They're actually philosophical arguments which aren't provable, which aren't testable, and that they're shoving down people's throats and forcing them to assume that because they're scientists, that they must be talking from a scientific basis. From an Islamic perspective, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses how we view his proof, his existence. He directs us to the reality, he directs us through the examples of Ibrahim alayhi salam, whereby he questions the reality, he uses the reality to make people think, and la uhibbul afilin, that, all of these things are limited. All of these things are limited, and therefore I don't worship any of these things, I worship the thing that created all limited things. So it's a very, very simple and something that can be followed through quite easily by way of proof. And that's because it links to the rational basis of the way we think as human beings, as opposed to this convoluted scientific method which in of its reality isn't even being followed by those scientists. So I just thought I'd make that comment, inshallah, just to, in terms of Muslim youth, not being scared. I think it's important, you've got to be confident that in Islam, تبيان لكل شيء in Quran, this is not something that's the answers have been left out of, that you can't find find the answers to your problems in there.
Yeah. So just to simplify your version of this, so what is your name?
Aish.
Aish. So Aish said, wow, first time I've heard of that name. Very nice name. So what Aish said was pretty much the idea that the way science is being used by certain atheists is that they are pretty much disguising philosophical claims with the scientific cloak. And I think we need to be wary of that and be able to give some of our youth the confidence to be able to challenge those narratives, regardless of the esteem of the presenters of arguments. And I seem to agree. And for me, I think the most fundamental thing that I think particularly young Muslims, if they really want to ground their faith, is the study of theology and metaphysics. Those two are key in really being able to consolidate one's frame of reference.
We'll take 2 more questions. So we'll take.
Both of them are my friends. So
Okay, so maybe not. Yeah. Don't go easy then. Okay. So all right, we'll take a third one. So we'll just take the questions at once. If you guys ask, and then you answer them.
Great. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
myself, welcome Muslim.
I wanted to ask if you think that, from our community and the fact that, lots of people are leaving Islam as well as a result of some of the things you've mentioned, do you think, because for me this has been an issue as someone who kind of, came from a Muslim background but didn't know much about Islam, was probably agnostic for a lot of my life and then kind of came back to Islam and started trying to intellectually grapple with it. Do you feel that there's a problem in establishing the bounds of orthodoxy within Islam? Like, what is legitimate Islam? Because I feel like we take a bit of a deconstructivist approach, which is a very kind of ultra-liberal left type of approach on lots of issues, where if you look at a very mainstream, debate will be that, ISIS are talking about chopping hands on the streets and throwing people off rooftops. And then, the counter argument is, but ISIS doesn't represent mainstream Muslims. That's not our interpretation of Islam. And then the justification for that will be that, there is no, essentially, it's really murky what comes under Orthodox Islam. And I feel that those bounds, at least for the masses, it's very difficult for us to understand what does come there, particularly with the lack of clarity between what falls under maybe fiqh and what falls under aqidah. An example of this is people being excommunicated for having beliefs about maybe evolution or other issues, which, like my question is, should they impact your belief or not? Should they kind of excommunicate you from a society? And is there a problem between us being able to put boundaries on, sure, this is acceptable and we can really navigate here. We can accept a very, very broad spectrum of belief and extrapolation within this field, but this stuff is going too far for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so it's
That's a big
heavy
my
question.
head is exploded. But okay, we'll get to you.
Yeah, so your title was Islam and Atheism, right? But I think you focus too much on new atheists because there's also a class of old atheists, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and they use actual intellectual arguments.
Yeah.
And I think this is probably where you come a bit more as well because you've got a social science background. Like, if you notice, because I did physics for my undergrad, right, and then social science for my master's. There's actually more atheists in social sciences than there are in sciences. You actually get a lot of, there could be Christian, Muslim, whatever, but you have deists and Hindus and all that stuff in sciences. In social sciences, virtually no beliefs in God at all. And their arguments are actually more sophisticated as well. So I think perhaps in the future when you're doing your course, integrate some way of dealing with those social arguments as well. Because they're often more severe, more penetrating as well than the scientific arguments. These are very easy to counter.
Thank you for your presentation. One thing you didn't mention in your speech, but was mentioned in your monograph, which was circulated towards the end, which I found quite surprising, I just wanted you to elaborate on that, was the fact that you seem to emphasize the literary miracle of the Quran as something almost, I scanned it very quickly, but it came across to me as that you were emphasizing something that we could kind of hold on to. So regardless of whatever else was going on, this was an area which hadn't been discussed, and those who were making arguments against hadn't entered into this space. I was just surprised that that was an argument you were using, because I would have thought that as far as, even though maybe something that we could appreciate, perhaps, or at least certainly at different levels, it's a very aesthetic, very subjective kind of matter. If you're looking purely the literature aspect of it, as opposed to, which didn't seem to come across as much, just the underlying, just the essential message. So I just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and just related to that perhaps, in the medium to long run, do you see, in terms of how this debate will pan out over time, do you think that it will ultimately be an issue of us being able to contend at that highest level of theology and theological, philosophical, metaphysical kind of engagement? Or do you think that actually, for the possibility of Islam to actually flourish in society, it will probably rest more on us being able to present a moral and ethical vision for society, just to deal with people's practical problems, practical issues, almost to deal with the fact that the increasing symptoms that we see of a godless kind of state of living?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to summarize and then answer the question for you. So you mentioned, are there boundaries of orthodoxy, or should there be boundaries of orthodoxy?
Communicable boundaries, things that are clearly communicated to, let's say, the masses, or even to people of knowledge.
Okay, so the idea here is that are there any fixed boundaries within orthodoxy, be it in jurisprudence, fiqh, or Quran, aqidah, however you want to call it, which can then be passed over, through which we can get a sensible frame of reference in which we can guide our narratives, be it in science, philosophy, or whatever the case is. Okay, so first of all, in the postmodern era, we're living in a world where relativism is pretty much the marking point of anything. So every perspective counts. And I can see this even in my own group of circles in academia. So things that were traditionally labeled as heretical are championed today as beacons of reason. That is, I think, because of postmodern narrative that's come out. But to answer your question short, because that is now entering theology, which is not the topic today, but it is a sensitive topic, that's why I'm just trying to keep it short. If you study traditionally in a madrasa or whatever, if you go through a fine-tuned program, you can see that there are general, broad frameworks of where our orthodoxy lies. This does not mean there are no nuances in the tradition. You will see several nuances, several different things on certain points. But there is a scope in which we can call orthodoxy. Now, whether that is communicable, it is a very sensitive topic because of the variety of different opinions and affinities and orientations, madhab that people hold. And I think that question is a very complicated and convoluted one because of that, the way it pans out according to the configuration of the society. So I'm not so sure of whether it can be done. I think so. I think it can be done.
And my question is more, do you feel like there's a link between people leaving Islam and the fact that we can't say that, you'll get, in my experience, two groups of people. One will say, oh yeah, you vote for gay marriage, that's fine, and there's Islamic evidence for you being able to do that as a Muslim. And another group will say, you'll be a kafir if you do that. But the fact that there's that someone can't really distinguish whether both are equally orthodox, or is one slightly heretical and one slightly orthodox. Do you know what I mean? Do you think that this
okay, so I think orthodox then might be too much of a strong term there, because orthodoxy means pretty much what keeps you inside or outside the fold of Islam. On matters like that, these may be secondary co-valid difference of opinions. For example, we have 4 schools of thought in jurisprudence. On some issues, we have 4 different opinions. That doesn't mean either one is orthodox. So I think in matters like those, this will be on a case-by-case basis, and you will have to ask shuyukh to get their opinion on this. And I'm not one, so I can't really answer that question. As the point you mentioned, so he mentioned about this idea of there are many more atheists on the humanities side than there are on the natural sciences. And this is correct. There are actually extensive papers written on this, which talk about that atheism is more prevalent, much more prevalent in humanities. And they also offer much more sophisticated arguments that we don't have maybe in necessarily new atheism. It's correct. What is very interesting for me as an observation, that I think the champion of atheism, at least in the past century, was Nietzsche. And yet none of them refer to Nietzsche as a standpoint, because I think he's conclusive. Huh?
They don't understand it.
Yeah, maybe they don't understand it, but I think he was a very conclusive thinker. I don't think they like some of his conclusions because it works against their narrative. But we can have a discussion of that later on. Iqbal, so thank you very much for your question. You asked a question regarding the monograph now. So just for everyone who's not aware, So some of the topics here were pretty much stemmed out of my monograph, which is available online for free. You can read that. And the point that what Iqbal was mentioning was, I mentioned that to ground one's faith, you have to literally resort on the literal miracle of the Quran. And whether that should be held up to the highest esteem on a theological level, or should we try and approach atheism towards a practical level? And I can understand why he has asked that question because of the work that he does. So for me, the literal miracle of the Quran was it was situated in the context of mistakes made by both atheists and new atheists. Atheists don't tap into what makes the Quran a miracle is its literary angle. And of course, many people think that this is a very subjective sense. Arabic is not built like the English language, where if you read Shakespeare, you might find something inspiring, and I read it and I find nothing. Arabic is built on several logical axioms inherent in the Arabic language. And you can show how certain words can figure into place, the conjugations figure into place. It is not as subjective as the way you're making it out to be. To understand that, I would definitely recommend, there's a sheikh that, what's his name? He spent about 45 minutes explaining one word in the Quran. He's from Saudi Arabia, I forgot his name. Salih Fawzan, maybe, I think it was Salih Fawzan, I'm not so sure. But he spent 45 minutes why a specific conjugation of a specific ayah had to be in this form in contrast to other 20 variations. There's very little subjectivity involved when it comes to that angle, so I don't think it has to be marked out as that. And it was also, in response to that, I think that those two are not necessarily competing mechanisms, competing at the theological level and at the practical level. I think the ideological method I'm trying to say is that if you really want to, break that narrative of stuff, okay, if you really want to do that, is you break the literal of the Quran. That's the way to go forward. And they haven't entertained that discussion at all. And I think we've also reacted to that in that to bypass the Arabic narrative of the Quran or the literary aspect of the Quran, we resort to miracles in the Quran, scientific miracles, which are gravely problematic in my opinion. And both sides are missing the point from what I can see. With regards to the practical level, I think, if Sheikh Ahmed, he mentioned in his talks, if you look at the history of Islam, most people didn't convert to Islam because of ideology. They converted to Islam because of akhlaq, of practical matters. But I don't think that they're in competition. I think that you're really good at the zakat part. I know you're in charge of NCF, and I know you've done a great job at it, and I think you've influenced a lot of people. That is your dawah. For me, I think that I need to focus on some other aspects, and we're both building that bridge together. So I don't think it's a competition. I think it's just different ways of approaching this.
I just want to say on that, part of what we do, start to do, is to fund scholars, support scholars.
Great, yeah, that's great, yeah. Is this part of the actual zakat or secondary sadaqah?
As part of it.
Fantastic.
So, okay, can we get you?
So if there's any questions now for the next 10 to 15 minutes, you can address them to either speakers.
Sure, yeah.